The following program is produced by Marshfield Community Television.
I'm going to talk to you about why I think gas stations are important. And here's my first swing at the ball. Gas stations are such interesting buildings because everyone experiences them. Anybody ever been to a gas station? Just a couple people in Marshfield. I don't know. I don't know what that says, right? But everybody goes to gas stations. Everybody does. Think of another building like that. School, libraries. Not everybody goes to the library, but it's pretty good. Church is about the same that way. Not everybody goes to church, but a lot of people do. But everybody goes to a gas station. It's part of our universal experience as 21st century Americans that we all go to gas stations. And we never give them a second thought. So I did. That's what the book is all about. I did. So I'm going to talk about some themes related to the history of gas stations to kind of give you, it's a kind of a little teaser of what's in the book. There's a lot more information in the book, but this will give you a little teaser about gas stations. First of all, the most important things about gas stations is they're there to make money. If they don't make money, they're out of business, right? And then somebody else takes over, or somebody has a better idea. So it's all about the money. If you want to see what influences how gas stations look, how they operate over time, where those changes were made, it's all about the money. Follow the money and you'll see how gas stations evolve over time. Gas stations are among the most changeful of all buildings. The average gas station only survives for about 20 years, 20 to 30 years, then it's torn down, it's replaced by another station, or converted into another use. Almost every gas station ever built has been torn down, which I think it makes it very interesting to study them. Gas stations go back to, in the earliest days of gas stations were nothing more than wooden shacks that people would, in the earliest days, gasoline for your car was often delivered to your house by horse and buggy or horse and wagon, which is a little ironic, isn't it? And gas came in 5-gallon cans, and so you'd have your automobile, and the gas tank was most often it was located underneath the front seat. So you have to flip the front seat up and get in with your big smock and your goggles and your duster, and put a funnel in the top of the tank and grab your 5-gallon can and put some cheesecloth on it to strain the bugs out and pour your gasoline into your car. And they were really crude places, and it wasn't until the development of the gas pump that gas stations really started taking off. That was invented in Washington State by a man who took a hot water heater and put a garden hose on the bottom of it and filled the hot water heater up with gas, and then just used gravity to feed it out. And then they figured out how to install a pump in it. And when that happens, gas stations start changing and they start becoming more like a more viable business, and also the number of cars starts to increase as well. So this image on the left-hand side here is of a very early gas station. It's in Ripon, Wisconsin, and it was right in the middle of the downtown. So imagine downtown Marshfield, one of the storefronts in the middle of the block. That's what the station was like. They just took a storefront, put an office in it, installed the pump on the curb, and the tanks out in the street and started pumping gas. And this was what was called a visible pump. We know all about visible pumps, right? So the idea behind this was there was a glass globe on the top here, and you pump the gas by a lever up into the tank, and then these markers told you how many gallons, and then you stick the hose in the tank and pull the nozzle, and it would feed by gravity down into the car. And those curbside pumps were fairly commonplace in the 1920s. But by the late 1920s, most cities banned them. They were really dangerous because, you know, I noticed it's a little slippery out the streets here today in Marshfield. You know, people would come along and they lose control of their cars and hit these things and knock them off their base out into the street, and gas was flowing everywhere. It also meant that you used the street as your place of business. So it would tie up traffic on the street as people were stopped along the edge of the street to get their gas. So they pretty much banned them. In the early days of gas retailing, they didn't really have an idea of how to market gas yet. Everybody was kind of on their own. And a lot of these stations would have multiple pumps from different oil companies. So they'd have a Sunoco pump and a Mobil pump and a Shell pump because there was no, they didn't brand them to a particular brand of gas. And these visible pumps, part of the marketing of gasoline was when you made the gas visible, they could use that as a marketing device. So they would dye gas different colors. Sunoco was blue, Shell was yellow. So that it was the way to kind of breed some brand loyalty. You know, I like that blue gas. I've never gone wrong with the blue gas, so I'm gonna get that blue gas. And they didn't have a very sophisticated marketing. I've looked at hundreds of photos of historic gas stations in Wisconsin, and these early photos, what I find so remarkable is the gas station chain might give them a sign, like Shell, but they didn't even give them the pole to put the sign on, and the sign would end up being leaned against the side of the station. Really common. So, you know, very unsophisticated marketing, and that meant that you had to market gas on your own. You had to come up with your own strategies to sell gas. The image on the right-hand side is from a independent oil company around the Madison area. This is a station of theirs in Madison, Helixson Service Station. And in 1934, they enter this into a parade as a parade float, and they built a little replica of the gas station out of oil cans. Some little pumps, a little car. Very first talk I ever gave for this book, a guy came up to me afterwards. Oh, this won first place, by the way, in the parade. And this guy came up to me afterwards and said, that might have won first prize in the parade, but I was sitting on that float when we were going down the road, and they didn't build that building very well because the oil cans were rolling off the roof and they were hitting us kids on the top of the head. So, you know, you're just really, in the early days, you're really on your own in terms of how to market and sell gas. But they start getting a little more sophisticated. By the 1920s, the mid-1920s, you see stations that look like these. Very exotic looking stations that look like crazy far off places. The one on the left-hand side was in Weyauwega, Wisconsin. It was a Texaco station, built like a Plains teepee. And the one on the right-hand side was a Wadhams station at 27th in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. So why did they make these buildings look like these exotic places? They're trying to capture people's imaginations because the automobile absolutely transformed the way that we lived. The average person before the advent of the automobile never traveled more than 30 miles from the place they were born in their entire life. Think of that. So they never got to Stevens Point. That's how small the world was. And when the automobile arrived, it just blew that apart. And all of a sudden, you could travel that far in a Sunday afternoon. It transformed people's lives and it opened up the world to them. So their imaginations went wild, and the gas companies went along with that. And so they decided, they started designing stations that were exotic and far off, and kind of spread that idea of the adventure of travel. The one on the right-hand side was designed by a man who was the most famous architect in Milwaukee at the time. His name was Alexander Eschweiler, and he was approached by the Wadhams Oil Company, which later became part of Mobil, and they asked him to design a station that they could replicate from place to place across the state, because they recognized that people were loyal to their station in their neighborhood, but they weren't loyal to the brand. So they're trying to figure out, well, how can we make people loyal to the brand so they buy Wadhams gas when they go to another place? Well, make the stations look alike so people recognize them. And so he came up with this Japanese pagoda design, and they built about 150 of these in Wisconsin. There are only about 4 that survive today. But it was a way to help start building a brand identity. Those exotic stations don't last very long. By the mid to late 20s, gas stations start looking like little houses. And the reason for that is that in the 1920s, there's so much agitation all across the country about the design of these gas stations. Remember our crude little wooden shacks? You know, when they start building gas stations in cities, they're typically built on the grand boulevards of the cities where all the rich people lived. And they would buy up a house and demolish it and put up a shack and start selling gas, and people were livid about it. And if you read the newspapers, there are all of these articles about the poor design of gas stations, and trying to pass moratoriums. The city of Stoughton banned gas stations and construction of any new gas stations in town because they thought there were too many of them. One of the city councilmen he cast the deciding vote was a gas station owner, and he just built a new station just before the vote. So he was happy to ban all new gas stations in town. But it was a huge problem. So the solution that the oil companies come up with is, if we're demolishing houses and we're building stations, let's make them look like little houses, so they fit into the neighborhood. There'd be less resistance to new stations then. So this is a pure oil station that looks like a little house. I'll talk more about that one in a bit. This one here is in Madison. It was voted in a national contest to be the second most beautiful gas station in America. And it's a beautiful building, right? It's got a tile roof, stucco walls, it's got stone laid in it, it's lit up at night, it's landscaped, it's really a beautiful building. So why did they spend so much money on making these really beautiful gas stations in the 1920s? Well, it's because they were trying to attract women. Why were they after women? Women drove more than men in the 1920s. They were the drivers of cars. Wealthy people owned cars. Wealthy women typically didn't work. So they had a lot of leisure time, so they drove their husbands' cars while the husbands were at work. And because of that, they had to start making amenities to attract women. This part of the station here, this was called the oil room, and that's where the grease monkey hung out. You know, and you go in there and it was dirty and smelly, and there was a lot of foul language. Not a place where women wanted to be found. So a new type of station emerged that was called a powder puff station. And the powder puff stations had these spaces that were designed just for women. And ladies, pay attention, because after I describe them, you may want to go talk to your local gas station. In this one here, if you go through this room, you entered the powder puff room, or the ladies' lounge, and it had Persian carpets on the floor, oil paintings on the wall, hammered beam ceilings, wicker furniture, very lavishly appointed on the interior. And the reason why they did that is so women had a place to go. Because women brought the cars in for servicing. They didn't want to hang out in the oil room with the grease monkeys. They wanted a nice place to be able to stay. And this also was a place for women who were traveling. Because in the early days of gas stations, there weren't waysides, there weren't any kind of roadside amenities at all. If you were traveling from one place to another and you had a stop, there wasn't a place for you to go. So these powder puff stations became refuges for women drivers as well. These were fairly, there were large numbers of these. They're pretty much all disappeared now. Madison had at least 3 of these in the city. Government institutions influenced the way that gas stations looked as well. I came across these photos when I was doing research for the book, and it's obvious something big happened here, right? So lucky for me, these photos were taken by a photographer named Angus McVicker. And Angus, when Angus's photos came to the Wisconsin Historical Society, they came with his logbook. And each one of these photos has a number. And in his logbook, you can look up the date he took the picture. So I looked it up, found the date, looked in the newspapers. Oh my God, what a story. So it was a first-hand account of a guy who had parked his car across the street, gotten out of his car, and turned and looked at the station just when this happened. The roof of the station exploded up into the air. The walls blew out. The station operator and his brother-in-law were standing next to the building. They were buried under rubble. They picked up these 2 slabs of concrete, spun them in the air. A guy who was walking down the sidewalk was blown out in the street by the force of the explosion. And the next day, the Wisconsin Industrial Commission shows up to investigate what had happened here at this station. They had just a couple of years before that, they'd been given power to regulate the design and construction of all gas stations in Wisconsin. And the reason why they're given that power was because gas stations were dangerous places. This was the second gas station explosion in Madison that year. And they traced the cause of this, and they found out that this station, like many other stations, was built on the site of a house. They demolished the house, they left the foundation in the ground, they filled it full of gravel, they ran wiring from the station underground to the pumps, and that gravel space filled up with gas vapor, and then there was a short in that line, and that's what that man saw. It sparked the gas, the whole thing exploded. So because of the Industrial Commission, they started regulating a lot more what gas stations, how they operated, and the Industrial Commission started setting standard regulations for it, what kind of materials it was built out of, what kind of, the design of the station itself. So gas station, you couldn't just slap up your own station anymore. You had to follow the guidelines of the Industrial Commission. For example, they got rid of all of those grease monkey pits. They made those illegal. And before the Industrial Commission, they would dig a hole in the ground and you just drive the car over to be serviced and then throw a ladder down in the hole, and a guy would crawl down in the hole and fix the car, work on it underneath, and then crawl back up. That's where that term grease monkey comes from, because he's coming up and down the ladder, in and out of the hole. So they get rid of stuff like that in the, for public safety. And so gas stations start looking a lot more alike because they all have to comply with these regulations. They also start becoming a lot more alike because of the powers of corporations, of the gas companies themselves, who control what the appearance of the stations are. This is that Pure Oil station we saw before. It's in Monroe. It was a Freytag's super service. And this station was designed by an architect named Carl Peterson. Pure Oil went to him and they said, you know, as we're expanding our gas chain, we want to start making all our stations look alike. So we want you to come up with a standard design so they all look the same, and then we know, then we have predictable costs. And we know when, because we build this one, we know how much it's gonna cost to build the next one. And, but the real fascinating thing is Carl Peterson didn't stop there. He convinced them to let him design everything. So he designed the gas, the oil cans, the gas globes, the stationery, the matchbooks, the road maps, everything. Designed everything for the company, all with one uniform look. And that's the beginning of corporate branding. Corporate branding starts with the Pure Oil station. So when you see that Nike swoosh or a Coca-Cola sign, that all leads back to Pure Oil. And because of those efforts, it meant that gas stations started looking a lot more alike as well, because they became part of a branded chain as part of the marketing of these oil companies. So how do we go from these cute little houses to gas stations that look like a tissue box? The answer is science. It's all about science. You know, in the early 20th century, science starts to be applied to a lot of business practices. It was called Taylorism at the time. And they do time motion studies, they do proactivity studies, and they started applying science to the design of things that were business related because it increased profitability. Very interesting thing about gas stations is there was almost no, architects hardly ever wrote about gas station design in the 1920s. I went through all of the professional architect publications, and there are only a handful of articles that talk about station design. Well, all that starts to change in the 1930s, and part of it has to do with increased competition. Standard Oil is broken up as a monopoly and forced to sell off parts of Standard Oil, and it allows for a lot more competition in the marketplace, and a lot of independent oil companies start coming up in the 1930s, and there was a little event that happened in 1929, as you might have heard about, the stock market crash. And you know, when the economy tanks, gas stations are only somewhat affected by it, because by then people were really becoming dependent on the automobile. So gas stations continue to sell, but there's a lot more competition in the marketplace. So they have to change the way they practice. One of the things that happens in the 30s is they start moving to a model of full service with service space attached to the station. So it's not enough to have just a little filling station in the house. you gotta have some service bays with it. In the 1920s, the gas station chains discouraged service. They didn't like it because they thought, you know, if you do a bad job on a car repair, then you may lose that person as a customer. They thought it was risky business. But by the 1930s, they're just trying to find profit anywhere they can, so they bring service in, and gas stations get service bays attached to them. And by 1934, one of the architect magazines, Architectural Forum, hires an architect whose name was K. Lomberg Holm, and they told him to study gas station design and to write a definitive thing about gas stations. And so the brilliant thing that he did is he went to the station owners and he got them to open their books, and he looked at the profit and loss of stations, and then looked at all the aspects of design and tried to figure out what is it that makes a station profitable? Why is one profitable and another one's not? And then he tabulated all that information. He came up with some guidelines for station design, and he looked at everything you can think of about station design. How far away are the pumps from the building? You want to have them far enough away that people drive in and they don't feel like they're being pinched there. They can come in and out easily, but it's got to be close enough that that attendant can be standing on the pump island by the time a car comes to a stop. They looked at where does the gas fill go? Where does the free air go? What's the most visible color? He determined that a white station with red trim was the most visible color, can be seen from the farthest distance away. Really important when you're running a business where your customers are moving quickly. He looked at how big the letter should be on the sign and how far away you can read. How far away can you read a 6-inch letter or an 8-inch letter? So when they were designing their signs, they knew based on the location what the size of the letter would have to be. He said, make the station entrance visible. So when you drive up, you automatically know where is the door to get inside of the station. Make the operator room windows big so that the attendants can see the cars coming, because, you know, I'm guessing some of you people grew up working at a gas station, and, you know, everybody I talked to who worked at a gas station, they all said, full service station, they all said, the owner wanted me on the pump by the time the car came to a stop. Well, that means you can't wait for the bell to ding. You got to be watching for those cars coming down the road. We looked at all aspects of station design, and the inescapable conclusion of his piece is that one type of station was a much more profitable station than any other one. And that's what the trade called the oblong box, which is the station we're looking at right here. Inexpensive to build, really efficient in terms of how it operated. So by the mid-1930s, they start building these oblong box stations, and these last as long as full service, which says a lot about how well the perfect this design is for full service, that they last as long as full service did itself. Technology also had an impact on the design of gas stations. This company here that designed this station in Pretty Sac is a company called the Trachte Company, and it was based in Madison. It was owned by a couple of brothers, and one of the brothers patented a corrugating machine that you could take a piece of steel and you could feed it through, and it would crimp it and make it stronger. And they made horse watering troughs out of it. So they bend it into an oval and make a horse trough. The business was pretty good, and they were making money. They had no idea what was going to happen a few years later, right? But they're making good money, and one of the brothers buys a 1909 Dodge, and he needs a garage for it. So he decides to stand those panels on end, bolt them into a steel frame and build a garage out of it. So he builds his garage, blows down 2 days later in a windstorm. But, you know, like a great entrepreneur, he's not, that doesn't slow him down. He keeps working at it, and pretty soon the neighbors are all saying, can you build one of those garages for me? Can you build them for me? And he realizes they've got a new business. It's putting up these prefabricated steel buildings, which were kind of perfect for gas stations because they could be erected quickly. They were pretty cheap. You can make whatever size you wanted. So if you wanted your station a little wider, add some panels. If you wanted narrower, less. If you want an addition on it, just put an addition on it. So this started out as a filling station, then they got a little more money and they added a service bay on it. Had the Tractis come back and design a service bay for them. So this model is so efficient at a time where the gas retailers are trying to build out the chains, lots of new stations being built, and they can all be put up real quickly with this new technology. So another company saw what Tractis were doing called Steel King, and they copied the Tracti buildings. The first buildings looked just like a total ripoff of the Tracti building, and they start building these buildings and marketing them for gas stations and do a successful business. And as I was doing research for the book, I Googled Steel King to see, you know, did anybody ever write anything about Steel King? Honest to goodness, they're still in business. They moved to Waupun and they're still in business today. So I call them up on the phone and I said, hey, I'm writing this book on gas stations. Do you have anything? They're like, oh my God, come out. We're so excited to meet you. So they come on, I go out there and they share the company history with me. And one of the great, the great story about Steel King is they, unlike the Tracti company that built buildings for just about anything, Steel King started designing and building just gas stations. And they became one of the largest manufacturers of gas stations in the United States. In a single year, they built over 600 gas stations from Florida up to Wisconsin, all steel frame like this with porcelain enamel panels on the walls. And you probably all remember those stations from the 1940s and 50s and 60s. The great thing about porcelain enamel, it's the same thing as the same cladding that we used to use on refrigerators and stoves. They're all stainless steel now, right? But it was this baked porcelain finish, and one of the real tough things about gas stations, you wanted your station to look clean and neat, but it's a dirty business. And you'd have a nice white station, you paint it up good, somebody gets a flat tire, they roll the tire up and they lean against the wall, they leave a big black mark on the side of your station. You know, there you go. So porcelain enamel was a beautiful material for that. You could just hose it off. It was very durable. So they start building these steel porcelain enamel stations and become very successful in doing it. What they do today is they build the canopies for full service or for self-service gas stations. The big roofs over the tops of the pump islands.
Everyone in town is a Steel King canopy.
Right, I know, that's amazing. You know, it's highly specialized work because you have to design those things for snow loads, wind loads, you know, tornadoes, hurricanes. They have to be very carefully engineered. So there are only a couple of companies that do that kind of work. And Steel King is huge in the industry. When the book came out, I went over to Steel King and I brought him a copy, and the owner is paging through the book. He's like, yeah, we did that canopy. Yeah, we did that one. Yeah, we did that canopy. It was like, oh geez, I never even thought to ask them which of the canopies they've done.
Who did you talk to when you went to Steel King?
Oh, I can't.
How long ago was
The
it?
president. It was like 10 years ago.
Dave Bailey?
What's
Dave Bailey and Dave Feline are the ones.
Dave Feline?
Okay.
Yeah, Dave
He
Feline.
lives in Monontolet.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So The full-service station becomes a really successful business model, but all that starts to change in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think one of the most remarkable things about gas stations is the rapidity in which the industry moves from full service to self-service. It happens over the course of about 8 years' time. It's just such a rapid development. The only thing I can think of that would be an analogy for that is the poor people who own typewriters when personal computers become big. Because there are very few industries that just turn the business model as quickly as that. So what causes that to happen? It's a number of different things. There are a number of different forces that come to bear. One of them is that these full-service stations, really the bread and butter of a full-service business was on repairs. They made more money on repairs than they did on the gasoline. So companies start emerging in the 60s and 70s that start stealing all the repairs out that don't need a mechanic. So Jiffy Lube, Rapid Oil Change, Mr. Muffler, radiator repair shops, Mr. Goodwrench. They start taking out that bread and butter business out of those full service stations and paying somebody a lot less than a mechanic's wages to do that work. And that was the work where all of the profit was. Gas stations didn't make a lot of money on the really expensive repairs, but they made a lot of money on like replacing a fan belt and things like that. So they steal all of that business out of the stations. At the same time, cars are getting a lot more complex. You're getting fuel injectors and electronic ignitions, and cars are becoming more technologically sophisticated. And then you have to take your mechanic and send them out to be certified to run the diagnostic equipment, to do those much more sophisticated repairs at the same time that you're doing a lot less work in general. So that economics of repair just start collapsing around these stations. Self-service as a concept starts taking off. The first self-service stations were in Texas by a company called 7-Eleven that many of you have probably heard about. 7-Eleven has this chain of 24-hour convenience stores, and an entrepreneur approached them and said, you got this big parking lot and you got somebody on staff. How about if I put gas pumps in your locations and you keep the books and we'll split the profits? The problem with that business plan was they kept the books and they saw the money come through from that, and they're like, well, this is a profit center for us. They kick that guy out and they just expand out. And so self-service starts taking off as a phenomenon. At the same time that happens, a little event happens that I bet everybody in this room remembers quite well, called the OPEC oil embargo. Oh, remember that? Wasn't that fun? Right? The OPEC, the Middle Eastern oil-producing nations get together and they form a group, and they start restricting the supply of gasoline to try to drive the price up. So they start price fixing the price of oil, and as a result, the supply gets constricted, and then we had lines down the block and shortages of gasoline, and the price of gas is going up, and people are complaining about it, and the poor station owners are caught between a rock and a hard place, and they're trying to find a way, how can I shave that price of gasoline down by 1/4 cent a gallon so that so I can keep my customers. And so the solution was go self-service, and then you reduce your your labor costs. So, as a consequence of all of that, in 1968, about 15% of all stations nationwide were self-service stations. 8 years later, almost all stations are self-service. It just happens overnight. And it really changes the economy of the operation of stations, and we move from that model of full service to a convenience store with self-service pumps. I talked to the owner of this place, and he told me he makes more money on a bottle of water than he does on a gallon of gas. Higher profit. The gas, you don't make all that much on it, but water. So what happens to all these old stations? Well, if you're Billy Schnabel, who owned that first gas station I showed you, the Gouda one with the red roof, that was his station. If you were Billy, you tried to sell your station. He retired in 1976. He put the station up for sale, and he couldn't find anybody to buy it. No one was interested, because everybody by that point, they're looking at these these stations just saying, oh, you know, what a money pit, never make up money on this thing. So he couldn't actually sell it. He ended up, it just stayed in the family, and it's a jewelry shop now, because his daughter still owns it. But a lot of stations just could not survive, and stations went out of business right and left in that period of time. So a lot of stations end up looking like this. They're abandoned, boarded up. Communities have so much trouble trying to figure out what to do with these stations because they're being abandoned in such large numbers. Some cities passed a moratorium and said you can't build another gas station in the town unless you tear one down. So if Mobil had a vacant station and they wanted to build a new one, they had to tear down another station first. As they start tearing these stations down, or the station sites are proposed for redevelopment, they find out that there's a dirty little secret underground. They have lust, leaking underground storage tanks, because these tanks have been underground for a long time, and nobody was paying attention to what was happening underground. So these station sites, they could have $100,000 of soil contamination underneath them. So no bank would loan on these things, and they just become a huge problem. What do we do about all of these? It's never really fixed until the states start stepping forward and creating brownfield grant programs to clean these sites up, so that these places can be redeveloped. Okay, I hate doom and gloom, so I'm going to tell you a little story that begins with a story of doom and gloom, and it ends with a story of hope. This station here, this is in Milwaukee. It was designed by an architect whose name is my favorite architect name in Wisconsin. No, it wasn't Frank Lloyd Wright. Urban Peacock was his name. His name was Urban Peacock. And he was a theater architect, which seems like the perfect name for a theater architect. Who designed that theater? Oh, that was Urban Peacock. So he designed the station in 1938, and it was successfully operated, and the man who owned it for a very long time did a successful business there. He sells the station in 1976. He's luckier than Billy Schnabel, and he finds somebody to buy it. That guy can't make a go of it. He sells it to someone else. That guy can't make it go. Sells it to another guy. That guy's like, I'm out of here. And he just leaves the station, just abandons it. Leaking underground tanks, windows all boarded up. It's an eyesore. The city of Milwaukee publishes a newsletter and features this station on the front of it. And the article basically said, if you see a building that looks like this, call the city of Milwaukee and we will condemn it and tear it down. So it was the poster child for abandoned and neglected buildings in Milwaukee. And it probably would have been torn down, but the neighborhood loved this station because these full-service stations, they were like the center of their communities. You know, they were places where people hung out, you knew the station owner, you got all the gossip, you know, from them about what was happening in town. They were places that were kind of the heart and soul of their neighborhoods, and this station was. So that the neighborhood rallied around trying to save it, and they got the city to forgive the back taxes. They got a brownfield grant to clean up the grounds. They found an owner. The owner used to start preservation tax credits to rehab this building, and he turned it into a coffee shop. So where it used to say greasing and washing, it says coffee and cappuccino. And it was a standard station. He took that standard oil torch and turned it into a coffee cup with steam coming out of the top of it. Then he named it after the neighborhood. The neighborhood's called Sherman Park, so he called it Sherman Perk. And now it's the center of the community again. And I think the greatest thing is it won the Mayor's Urban Design Award the year it was finished. So, poster child for abandoned and neglected, Mayor's Urban Design Award, the best design in the city of Milwaukee that year. So, there's hope for stations, is what I'm saying. One more story. This station is in Independence, and it's a 1927 standard plan Texaco station. We were finished writing the book. We were just putting the last touches on it. And I happened to be driving from Eau Claire from La Crosse to Eau Claire, early in the morning. I come through Independence about 6:45 in the morning, and I see this station, and I locked up the brakes. I was like, oh my God, look at that station. So 6:45 in the morning, the garage bay is open already. And so I pull over, I go in the station, and I yell under a car, and this guy comes out. His name's Lauren Nelson. He's the owner of the station. And Lauren tells me this amazing story. He said, you know, I had an internet business, a junkyard, and I owned a couple of gas stations. And one day I have a brain aneurysm, and I almost die, and they rushed me into surgery. They saved my life. Doctor says, you can never work again. He said, I'm not the kind of guy that likes to sit on my hands. So I decided what I would do is I'd buy this 1927 station and I'd restore it, and then I'd just work on cars in there. So that's what he did. He bought all of this vintage signs, the clean restrooms, you know, tires, all of that, paints it all up, puts a Coca-Cola machine out in front of it. He crawls up on a ladder and he strips 10 coats of paint off of this sign. This is called a banjo sign. They're very rare today, quite valuable. He strips all the paint off and exposes the original porcelain enamel on it and opens up a business there. Ladies, I'm going to tell you a story about what the meaning of love is. So just bear with me here for a minute. For his anniversary, his wife bought him a matching set of Texaco vintage pumps to put out on the pump island in front of the station. And he sits here in the operator's room here and does his paperwork when he's working on cars, and he loves to see people pull up at the pumps. He said, they'll pull up. And then I see him look at the pump, 36 cents a gallon. He said they look at the pump, then they look ahead and they sort of stare for a minute. Then they look at the pump again, and then they very sheepishly and slowly drive away, and Lauren has a belly laugh. This is hilarious. When the book came out, I did an event in Independence, and he showed up at it, and he shook my hand, and he said, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You made me famous. And I said, what do you mean, Lauren? He said, tour buses come, they pull up outside every day, and I get on the bus and I tell them the story of the station. So, there is a reason to save old stations like this, because they tell us something about the transformation of culture that results from the advent of the automobile. The automobile changes culture in a really significant way. We talked about a lot of those things, the development of corporate branding, the first credit card was a gasoline credit card, 1930s. The way it transforms the lives of people, the lives of women, opens up the world to women. Some people believe that the reason why suffrage passed was because of the automobile, because it allowed women to get out and rally together to work for the women's vote. The 100th anniversary of that is coming up in the next few months, by the way. So it's transformative, and I think it's important that we save some of these stations, just because, like railroad depots, they tell the story of the changes that happen in culture as a result of the advent of the automobile. All right, so shameless plug. I brought some books with me. If you want to buy a book, $25, cash or check. I don't get any of the money, by the way. I give it all to the Wisconsin Historical Society. Yep, there I am on Facebook. Be a Facebook fan. Jim Drager, architectural historian. You can also read my book, Bottoms Up: History of Taverns and Breweries in Wisconsin. I'm working on a couple more books right now. I'm working on a book on the history of vacationing in northern Wisconsin, the story of resorts and summer houses. I'm working on a sequel to Bottoms Up, so if you think, oh my God, I can't believe you missed that bar, I want to hear. And I'm working on a book on Wisconsin churches. So if you know of some really unique, interesting church, I'd love to hear from you about that too. All right, we could go all night, but we're not gonna. I promise. So thank you all for coming.